I am Tatiana Bazzichelli, the director of the Disruption Network Lab for the people that are just connecting now. And together with me, we have Sally Hayden, Philipp Schönberger, Franziska Schmidt, and this panel is moderated by Roberto Perez-Rocha, that I'm very happy to introduce, and is going to introduce the speakers. The title of this panel is Migration, Failing Policies and Human Rights Violations. Roberto Perez-Rocha is the director for the International Anti-Corruption Conference Series at Transparency International. That is the world's largest independent anti-corruption forum that is actually next week, right? So coming soon. Thanks for being here despite all the work you are doing for that. Roberto is also the founder of the IACC Young Journalist Initiative, the Film for Transparency Festival, and the Fair Play Anti-Corruption Music Competition. For over 25 years, he has been worked globally in advocacy, governance, and transparency. So thank you, Roberto, for being here, and I leave the stage to you.
Well, thank you. It's on? Thank you very much, Tatiana. It's a pleasure to be here, to finally get to meet you and to get to meet the crowd from Disruption Lab. You guys are doing tremendously good work, so I'm really, really happy to be here, even though, as you said, with a bit of stress, because we start on Monday. It is an honor to be moderating this panel, and of course, my job is to be brief and to control the time, mostly, and hopefully I can draw some interesting questions after your initial introductions. So let me start by reintroducing our member from the panel. First and foremost, my friend and colleague, Sally Hayden, Irish, who has been in the front line reporting human rights violations and more abhorrent situations that asylum seekers go through in the north of Africa, mainly. And next to her, we have Franziska Schmidt and Philipp Schoenberg, which I understand you guys are students still, kind of, very good, who have a legal support project, particularly on the island of Samos in Greece. For all of you who don't know the island of Samos, most likely you may not find it on Instagram, so you have to look into other more kind of newsworthy sources because of the migration situation that is going over there. Without further ado, I would just like to give a 30-second reflection. As a Mexican, and as I mentioned before, I am sort of pompously labeled as an expat here in Berlin because, of course, I came with resources, I came with a passport, and I came with a job. For the rest of the people around the world who do not have any of the three, then they are called migrants. And for the expats, we always try to climb the stairway to heaven. For the migrants, usually is the roadway or the highway to hell. So you're going to tell the story of what you have found, which I think is extremely, extremely important, because if it's not making the news, then they become invisible. And if they don't have a hand that can support them, they are helpless. And we're talking about tens of millions of people around the world. So thank you very much. I'm honored to be here with you guys. And maybe I should give the voice to you two first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you also from our side for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity to speak about the situation of the migrants on Samos and also our work. Yeah, first maybe a quick outline. We're gonna quickly introduce the Refugee Law Clinic Berlin and its project on Samos. Then we would like to portray the situation on Samos and give an overview about the human rights violation taking place there. And as a response to that, we present our work on Samos, and then in the end we try to give a little outlook or maybe ask questions. Yeah, the Refugee Law Clinic Berlin was founded in 2014 at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And just really quickly, the structure of a so-called law clinic foresees the concept of law students giving free legal advice. And ideally, this concept creates a win-win situation in which the students can gain experience in legal counseling and the advice-seeking person receives free legal information. During the administrative crisis of 2014 and 15, the need for independent legal counseling in the field of migration and asylum law increased drastically. And the RLC Berlin established a one-year training cycle consisting of a weekly lecture, an internship with an asylum lawyer, and various workshops to train interested people in the field of asylum and migration law. The counselors trained by the Refugee Law Clinic Berlin counsel in various teams all over Berlin on a regular basis, and the organization is still almost entirely student-run and on a voluntary basis. And since 2018, the Refugee Law Clinic Berlin is also present on Samos with its legal information project. And the team there consists of 2 to 4 counselors, a coordinator, a Greek lawyer, and interpreters for the languages Arabic, Persian, and French.
Yes. So how comes that we are working on Samos and why Samos? It's a Greek island that is located right off the Turkish coast, and Samos is home to one of the so-called hotspots on Greek islands, a reception facility that hosts several thousand people. This camp is located right next to the capital of the island. So maybe the next, yeah. It's right next to Vathi, and in the middle you can see the white buildings are the official camp structure, and the red line indicates the informal settlement that has grown somehow around this official structure. In order to better understand the situation on Samos, I'd like to briefly outline the architecture of the so-called hotspots approach. The existence of the hotspots is closely linked to the EU-Turkey statement of 18 March 2016, which is also often referred to as the EU-Turkey deal. And in that agreement, the European Union and Turkey agreed that first, all migrants crossing from Turkey into Greek islands will be returned to Turkey. And second, that for each Syrian that is returned from one of the Greek islands to Turkey, another Syrian will be resettled to a European country. And in order to implement that first part of the deal, these hotspots were created on the islands where most of the migrants were passing through, and one of them being Samos. And prior to 2016, people could just cross through the islands and then continue their journey, but since then, the arriving asylum seekers have to undergo the special border procedure. This includes the asylum seekers being placed under geographic restriction, which means that they are prohibited from leaving the island until it has been examined whether they can be returned to Turkey or whether they have a claim for international protection. And so this is the purpose of these hotspots. And of course, it was also considered an advantage to assess the right to remain of an incoming person right at the external border before people are really able to enter European soil. And this practice should facilitate an easier deportation also in case of negative outcome in the asylum procedure. So you can already see that the geography of these islands plays a major role in their function in the European border policies. And so we disagree with this practice to deal with asylum seekers, but in particular we disagree strongly with the system that has been set up on the islands. But since we also see this as the outcome of European politics, we wanted to give an answer of European solidarity, and so this is the reason why we are now with this project on Samos. But it's also important to highlight that what we are reporting now concerns the situation in Samos, but the situation is basically the same on all 5 hotspots. I mean, you've heard probably about Lesbos, but also on Chios, Leros, and Kos, which are not so often in the media, the situation is more or less the same. In the following, we want to give you an overview over the situation that migrants are facing when they arrive on Samos. And as a preliminary remark, I wanted to briefly refer to the title of this conference also because in our eyes, this phrase describes the underlying rationale of the European hotspot policy pretty well, which describes them as borders of fear. Because after 4 years, it becomes more and more difficult to believe this narrative, the predominant narrative of a crisis, of overburdened structures and overburdened authorities, and also this narrative of a failure of the European Union. To the contrary, it becomes increasingly evident that the situation is upheld on purpose in order to deter people from crossing to Europe and to ask for asylum. So when we talk about borders and migration, it's important to understand that these camps and the human suffering, they inevitably cause that they have become an important part or important cornerstone in this architecture of European border policies that aim at deterring migrants from entering the European Union. So in our view, the suffering and the rights violation that we constantly talk and we constantly try to call attention to are the result of a deliberate political decision, and that this decision is not primarily taken in Samos and also not really or not predominantly in Athens, but to a large part in Brussels and also in Berlin.
Coming now to the human rights violations we observe. We would like to say something to the illegal pushbacks, and while the pictures of the notorious living conditions in the hotspots have accompanied us already over the past years, the major human rights violations now already occur before people arrive on the actual island. So people are intercepted by the Greek Coast Guard or Frontex, put on this life rafts that can be seen there and drift back into Turkish waters. We received these reports of single events already since 2018, since our existence on the island. But since March 2020, however, this practice gained a new dimension and has recently been documented in the German media also. And we see this as the reason why the numbers of new arrivals on the Aegean Islands are close to zero now since March. And just 2 weeks ago, the omission of a rescue mission by the Greek Coast Guard or Frontex led to the death of a 6-year-old in front of the coast of Samos. But after this panel, there will be another panel on the pushback, so we don't go in further detail here. And then also regarding the living conditions, the hotspot is built on an old military basis, which was built for 648 people, which you can see here in purple. And but the huge backlog in the asylum procedure soon led to the camp being overcrowded. Last winter, the number of residents went up to over 7,000 people, which is more than 10 times the actual capacity. The informal setting around the official camp is called the jungle, how Philipp already said. And when people arrive on Samos, they are left in the camp without any material support, like tents, mattresses, blankets, sheets, or pillows. And also the condition of the sanitary facilities are quite horrible. According to MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, which are also present on Samos, in spring 2020, there was one toilet per 300 people, which is almost 10 times lower than the recommended minimum standards. The lack of the infrastructure in the camp, such as lighting and lockable sanitary facilities, enhance the risk of sexual assault and other forms of violence. The tension created by locking up thousands of traumatized people from different communities in overcrowded facilities was foreseeable, especially if this includes communities which might have been rivaling in their home country. With no actual system in place which is able to secure safety, it was also foreseeable that this tension resolves itself in violence. And this violence unravels itself often against the most vulnerable people, such as women, LGBTQI+ people, and minors. In fall 2019, the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights said the following on the situation on Samos. This no longer has anything to do with the reception of asylum seekers. This has become a struggle for survival. And at this point again, the camp has been overcrowded since a few months after the implementation of the hotspot system in 2016. Even if one would claim that these developments have not been foreseeable, they are visible and has been accepted for 4 years now. Apart from this, in terms of other assistance for the asylum seekers, one has to stress that, or one has to mention that the food, the difficulty of receiving food in the camp, the people have to wait around 2 hours for a meal, and people report us very often about the poor quality, insufficiently nutritious, and sometimes moldy food. Pregnant women were even recommended to not eat this food. And people receive only 1.5 liter of water per day per person. The Greek system additionally does not foresee any cash assistance for asylum seekers. Only UNHCR is currently taking care of this, and people receive 75 euros per month. And additionally to this very small amount of money, the asylum seekers are not able to discharge more than 20 euros in cash from these credit cards they receive, which should prevent them from maintaining the infrastructure which they set up themselves in the camp. But this practice, however, does not prevent the merchandise as such, but forces the means of payment to shift from monetary to other forms of compensation. In theory, asylum seekers are allowed to work while being in the procedure. However, as you might imagine, the chances of finding a job on an island is close to zero.
The access to health is also extremely difficult and extremely limited. There's between 1 and 3 doctors attending all the people in the camp, which were up to 7,000 in spring. And as you might imagine, it's therefore really difficult to be seen by a doctor. At times, people were sleeping in front of the doctor's office in order to get an appointment. And also their services are limited to just treating the most obvious emergencies. And even if people, even in urgent cases, the specialized treatment that is required is often not available. To give you one example, at the moment we are accompanying 10 people with chronic hepatitis B infections, which untreated is likely to cause liver cirrhosis, and that once that happens, it has really serious implications for your physical condition and also significantly reduces life expectancy. And these people have been diagnosed by the hospital, so they had the chance actually to go to the hospital and get a diagnosis already months ago, and they already show symptoms of having developed liver cirrhosis, and still the authorities do not react to this information. So the hospital even issued a paper stating that it's really urgent that these people being seen by a specialist. The specialist is unfortunately not available on the island, but nothing happened, and in some cases people are still on the island today, and the authorities know about their condition since last December, so over a year, and nothing has happened. And this is just one example. Next to this, there are cases of cancer, HIV, epilepsy, and other critical medical conditions that are not attended. And additional to these conditions, which are rather comparably easy to diagnose, many people suffer from psychological issues such as severe PTSD. High number of seemingly healthy people suffer from the aftermath of being survivors of torture, sexual and gender-based violence, human trafficking, or coming from war zones or other extremely violent environments. And the access to psychologists or psychiatrists is even more difficult, as there's most of the times only 2 of them available on the island. So none of these mental health issues are properly addressed. Then another point that we have been constantly raising over the 2 years that we've been on the island is that of the risk of fires. So long before Moria burned down, there have been always fire incidents, major fire incidents in all the hotspots, and also deaths occurred. Even like just on Samos, we had 5 major incidents in the last 13 months. And well, I just jump over them quickly, but each time several hundred people lost their shelter in fires. Among them 80 miners when the container, where there's a safe zone in the camp where the miners, the unaccompanied miners are based, and containers burned down where they were located. And only this month we already had 2 major fire incidents with one time 150 people, and on 11th of November 600 people losing their shelter. And each time it was only due to NGOs that asylum seekers were equipped with new tents. As Franzi mentioned before, people don't receive any material assistance when they arrive. And each time people were quickly sent back to build their tents up on the very same grounds. And it's obvious that these are not isolated incidents, but that it's just impossible to keep any fire safety measures in an entirely informal settlement that has grown around the official camp structure. Next to the living conditions, we also observe violations of people's procedural rights. And as already described initially, the hotspots serve the purpose of completing the special border procedure and to assess whether people can be deported to Turkey. And for those people who cannot be returned under the EU-Turkey deal, because Turkey is not a safe country for them, which is almost like the majority of the people, the asylum procedure follows, and in which the authorities, puts in simple terms, assess whether a person can be deported back to the home country or whether they are in need of international protection. Both decisions are taken based on an interview with the applicant, in which they have the chance, the one-shot chance to give all the reasons for fleeing and why they could not be deported to Turkey. And the way these procedures are carried out has proven to be problematic in several terms. On the one hand, we stressed this already in the beginning, there's a lack of independent legal information. Most of the asylum seekers arriving on Samos have no clue about the procedures, and they have the right to be informed, but the information sessions that are given last around 20 minutes. They take place immediately after their arrival, and when we talk to people, we soon recognize that they have very little understanding of the relevant concepts, like the status of a refugee, family reunifications, what the EU-Turkey deal actually means, as well as the special rights that apply to vulnerable people. Another point is that there's a huge lack of legal representation. As mentioned before, the outcome of the asylum procedure is based mainly on what is said in this interview. And in order to be able to fully comprehend the consequences of that, so like errors or mistakes that occur during this interview cannot be corrected afterwards. And so it's really important to prepare people for these interviews and also to be able to see and talk to a lawyer. And that is just not possible because most of the time a maximum of 10 lawyers were present on the island. Yes. So, and then another point, and I will cut that short, is the duration of this fast-track border procedure. It was initially designed to last 28 days, but I think, I have never seen any case that complied with this deadline, but in contrast, we've seen people being stuck on the islands for months and even years, and some of the people that have their interviews right now, they arrived in January 2019, so you can imagine the duration this procedure is taking.
In regard to the family reunification procedure, the asylum seekers arriving in Greece have the right to be reunified with their members of the core family, which are already residing in other European countries. But the number of the rejected family reunification applications is very high, especially from Germany. And the rejection is often based on lacking documents to prove the family ties. It is, however, very nearly impossible to get hold of an adequate substitute on Samos, like, for example, a certified DNA test. And yeah, this high number of rejection leaves a lot of asylum seekers being separated from their families for an unnecessarily long time. And the number of minors falsely documented as adults are additionally deprived from their right to be reunified with their families for an extremely long time. And this fact seems especially unnecessary as it would be such an obvious and logical way to reduce the numbers of the residents in the hotspot. To explain you quickly our work, as I said before, we see our project as a response in European solidarity to the aforementioned shortcomings. And we are on the island since spring 2018. And right now we are happy to say that we are financed by the Stiftung Zivile Seenotrettung, which also enabled us to hire a Greek lawyer since July 2020. Our daily work consists of several times a week holding a workshop in different languages. In these workshops we explain the asylum procedure in general, which its specifics in regard to the EU-Turkey deal, the vulnerabilities and the different preconditions to receive asylum. And in individual sessions we prepare the applicants for their asylum interview. We also assist the asylum seekers with their application for family reunification, and we explain the rights during the procedure, especially for the most vulnerable people like survivors of sexual and gender-based violence or LGBTQ plus persons.
I think we really have to hurry up to finish. Part of our work over the past year has also been to try to take cases to the European Court of Human Rights in an urgent procedure. So the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, they can order interim measures in cases where they find a real risk of irreparable harm. We filed around 60 requests for interim measures to the court, and almost all of them were granted. They all address the living conditions in the camp and in regard to people with particular vulnerabilities, such as pregnant women, unaccompanied minors, people with chronic hepatitis B infections that I've talked about. And in case this request is granted, the court orders the Greek government to provide an adequate accommodation and medical treatment. And this has proven to be a rather useful tool in order to pressure the authorities to provide appropriate accommodation or move people from the island.
In regard to the COVID-19 related lockdowns, the illegal pushbacks to Turkey, and a new, most likely to be closed camp being built on Samos, we saw the need to make our services available online as well. In spring 2020, members of the Refugee Law Clinic built the website ihaverights.eu. The one purpose of this website is the possibility to create the possibility for asylum seekers to reach us online if they would like to receive assistance for the applications for interim measures in front of the ECTHR. And the other purpose is to inform the non-legal professionals about the procedure as such and the outcome we succeeded. The digital availability of legal assistance, so-called legal tech, is more commonly known in the consumer rights sector, such as flight right, weniger Miete, etc. And we see the disadvantages of such services being available online, especially in the field of human rights. However, the question remains, what kind of suitable solution will there be in regard to asylum seekers being moved further and further away from the accessibility to civil society?
Kind of cut off, and then we'll move to the Q&A later on with you guys,
Sorry.
as well as with Sally. So, I mean,
didn't see the sign.
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It was a tremendous presentation. And, I mean, just a very, very short reflection in regards to working in the island of Samos. I mean, if you zoom out, map that you gave, and you see all the other islands who are next to it, and you continue zooming out, you will find that, Samos is a little tiny dot on the global map. And if you think about what's going on not only in the region, but in the north of Africa, and then you move to Central and South America, as our previous panelist was talking, you will see basically that the whole planet is tainted with problems of migration, problems of asylum seekers, where race, culture, languages pose barriers, and on top of that, of course, politicians, human traffickers, and whatnot make things even harsher, worse, or even deadly for the people who are looking to have, a safer way of living. So it is quite important to zoom in just to understand the complexity, but at the same time, the hugeness or the size of the problem in one particular part of the planet, and then, of course, extrapolate to understand how daunting this problem is. Now we move to Sally. I just kind of reintroduce her once again. Besides being a freelance journalist, I'm proud to say that she's a member of our senior Journalist for Transparency Network, and is also a multi-award winner journalist, particularly from her country, Ireland, for having kind of continually reported and advocated for stories that have implicated and have caused even shockwaves within the United Nations human system. So Sally, thank you again. Thank you for the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just timing myself so that I definitely don't go over. Yeah, that was great, guys, and also very useful too in terms of what I'm going to talk about, which is North Africa, because they talked about the EU-Turkey deal, which was kind of the original prototype for what's now also happening in the Central Mediterranean. So, like they spoke about, this policy is basically about making sure that people don't reach Europe. So there's been a lot of pressure in Europe to stop migration, to stop people from arriving. And that's kind of involved slight gymnastics on the part of Europe in terms of what it can and can't do and what violates international law. I'm going to speak about Libya and particularly migrant detention centres, which is what I've been reporting on for the last 2.5 years. So what happens for people who don't know is that Libya has long been a destination or kind of a launching pad for refugees and migrants from all over Africa. So people escaping, war in Somalia, dictatorship in Eritrea, Boko Haram in Nigeria, or potentially economic problems as well, like crushing poverty, will head for Libya and try and cross the Mediterranean from there and reach Europe. And so what the EU has been doing, because it would violate international law to actually stop boats themselves and return people to Libya, what they do is support the Libyan Coast Guard, who are kind of a slightly ragtag collection of people, some of whom used to be smugglers, this has been proven, who are now being supported to intercept these boats and bring people back to Libya. So my reporting has specifically focused on what's happening to the tens of thousands of people who have been intercepted over the past 3 years, who have been brought back to Libya. And if you speak to European politicians or even Frontex, the border agency who I talked to last week, they'll say they don't have oversight because Libya is a sovereign country, even though it's a country at war, it's a country with multiple governments. They'll say that they don't have oversight. So my reporting has completely focused on, I'm going to find out what is happening to the people who get sent back as a direct result of EU policy. I wanted to say, so I believe Tatiana mentioned it at the start, I wanted to show you photos that I've been sent of refugees in detention centres send me photos that they want people to see to show what is happening to them. I've been told it's not appropriate for this conference, so I'm going to ask you to just imagine what I'm talking about. But I do want to give a warning that I'm going to talk about some upsetting incidents, particularly related to murder, torture, so just so people are aware. But yeah, for me, I think it's important that Europeans know about this. Like, I think that we need to know what's being done in our name, what's been done by our politicians, and what's been done as a result of our policy. So the first detention center that contacted me, people were in one called Abu Salim, or it was called Ain Zara, and then they got moved to Abu Salim. It was 500 people who were in a war zone. They'd been abandoned by guards. It was men, women, and children. They were absolutely terrified. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. And there was literally no oversight. No aid organizations could get to them. These were all people who had tried to cross to Europe and been forced back. And that was the first group. And I stayed in touch with them for like a long time. And we're actually going to hear from one of the guys who was there tomorrow. So I'm not going to go too much into that. Then there was Trikasika, another detention center, which was basically the headquarters of DCIM. So these detention centers are affiliated with the Libyan government, the GNA Tripoli-based government, and effectively they're run by militias, but technically they're affiliated with it. So this one was actually the official or unofficial, depending on who you talk to, headquarters. And I got sent information that one of the detainees there set himself on fire because he wasn't able to be evacuated. He believed that he had no way of getting out of the country. And at the time, there was a tuberculosis outbreak. So there are a lot of, all the men there, hundreds of men were locked in what is essentially a cage. They weren't being given fresh air. There was tuberculosis. People weren't getting medicine. They were worried that they were all going to die of this TB anyway. And again, it was a situation where they managed to get the information out, but help didn't come. And yeah, you can see the fact that happened there was it just shows you how nowhere is safe. And what was happening was refugees, they're getting returned, and certainly at the time we're getting locked up indefinitely. So there's no way to get out unless you get approved for evacuation, for legal evacuation through the UN. And that the chances of that happening are really minuscule. Because there aren't enough spaces. And again, this is an argument that we hear. So, people should take legal routes. But the fact is that because European or North African countries aren't offering enough spaces, it means that the legal routes just don't exist for most people. So there isn't a way for you to get out legally. And of course, everybody certainly that I speak to, they'd rather have a legal route to safety. They don't want to be trying to cross the sea. Trying to cross the sea is the last resort. There's another detention center called COMS. That was one where we documented people. So when they get caught by the Coast Guard, they get brought back, and COMS, which I'm pronouncing wrong, but it's it's, you know what I mean? It's on the coast, and so refugees are brought directly there when they're caught on the sea. And we actually, because I was in touch with them when these refugees were sent back, they were saying, we're terrified, we think we're going to be sent back to traffickers. So one thing that happens is that the management or the guards will actually sell them back to human traffickers, and then they'll be held for ransom again until their families can raise money and they can be sent out to sea. So that was a place where I was updating live as they were saying, please help us, we need someone to come and do something because they're going to sell us back to traffickers. And eventually, dozens of people were sent back to traffickers. And this was, again, a situation that you can just see, how impossible it is to get anyone to intervene, yet we know what's going on. There was then a war broke out, so April 2019, Haftar in the east, Khalifa Haftar, who's general, tried to attack Tripoli. And of course, the migrant detention centers are also military bases in almost all cases because they're being effectively run by militias. And so they are also sites where weapons were being stored. And they were also sites, in many cases, where migrants were actually being forcibly recruited as well. And in this case, Kasr bin Gashir, a militia attacked the detention center. We're not sure exactly why, but people who were there, who I spoke to, said that they felt that the the militia basically wanted to use it as a military base without the migrants inside it. So they attacked it and killed several people, and we don't even know exactly how many died. And you can see, like, for a lot of these incidents, like in that case, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, I think both called for it to be investigated as a war crime, but because there are incidents just developing again and again, so much is happening, you know, the investigations don't happen. Then there's a detention center called Zintan. This was, again, hundreds of refugees who had been forced back from the sea, were locked up there, and this was out of Tripoli. And it was very hard to reach for aid organizations. And at one stage, people started dying there, like probably one person every 2 weeks was dying. So 23 people died over a period of less than a year. And again, it was a situation where you're trying to get help. Like, I knew that the deaths were escalating. I was contacting every humanitarian organization. Nobody was helping them. And one woman that I interviewed, both her son and her husband died inside the detention center. Certainly her son, it was believed to be appendicitis. He could have been saved, and she was calling for days for him to be helped. But that wasn't, you know, it just didn't happen. And then there was Tajura, which is probably the one, if anybody's been following this, it would be the one that you did hear about, which was a migrant detention center bombing in eastern Tripoli. And again, this was very predictable. The migrants and refugees inside the center were literally saying, like, we're going to be targeted. This is going to happen. Like, please move us. You have to move us. There was a minor attack in May. And then in July, there was a bombing there, and at least 53 migrants and refugees died who had been locked up, and they were being held again beside weapons. So again, it was completely preventable. And they, I mean, you know, both sides were blamed because, like, Haftar's forces may have been behind the actual bombing, but they said that this is a military base, and the refugees were saying, well, we're being held as human shields effectively by forces aligned with the government. So again, like, the problems about accountability are quite complex. So in terms of my reporting, I mean, I've been trying to just document this as best I could and trying to make sure that people are actually listening, like actually understanding what happens. And as I said, like, this is all happening because of European policy. Like, these are the consequences of European policy. So if we have these policies, we need to also analyze the effects of them. And I think it's something to bear in mind, like, when you hear, you know, rhetoric saying things like, well, we save lives at sea by supporting the Libyan Coast Guard. Like, you also need to question what happens when people are brought back to a country where they are seen as, you know, human cargo. They are seen as things to be exploited, like, not even people, like, just, you know, like, you know, cargo. And also then, you know, there's constant wars, there are militias, and there's a question of whether the EU is effectively empowering the militias by spending this money. Then in terms of accountability, another thing that I reported on that actually relates to my work with Roberto, because it was funded by Journalists for Transparency. I went to Ethiopia for all of October. So, sorry if I haven't explained it very clearly, but the way that smuggling works, that people will come to Libya and they essentially pay, like, they might pay money before they go, but then once they get there, they can be held for ransom, tortured, and made to pay more and more and more. So it's not really like, it's not just smuggling, like you make an agreement and then you pay what you said you would. You get stuck in this cycle that's, like, very, you know, expensive and aggressive and exploitative. And I found out that 2 of the smugglers, who are very well known, who were sending people out to sea, were arrested in Ethiopia. So I actually met a guy, a victim of one of the smugglers, who's an Ethiopian, and he didn't manage to make it to Europe. He had tried, but he got sent back to Addis Ababa, like the capital of Ethiopia. And one day he was in the street last February. He saw his smuggler in the street, and he like very bravely ran over to the police and was like, "You have to arrest that guy. Like he's a really big human smuggler." And they did arrest him. And it ended up with 2 smugglers in prison, so one called Kadani, one called Walid, who are both very well known. And between them, according to victims, I mean, it's very hard to estimate, but it's believed that they could have brought as many as 30,000 people through Libya, or held 30,000 people for ransom. And many of them would have crossed the sea because they were working for years. But the problem was that after the Libyan Coast Guard began to be funded by the EU, because there was basically no escape, there was no way for the refugees to cross to Europe, or it became a lot harder. The smugglers began to hold them for longer and longer and charge more and more ransom and make them pay again, sell them between each other. And yeah, these 2 guys were like very guilty of that. So anyway, I ended up in Addis in a courtroom. I went to 7 hearings, I think, watching victims go up and testify against these 2 men, and they were incredibly brave. Like, I can't even imagine you doing that, like going into a courtroom and talking about what these people have done to you. And the part that I found very surprising about it was that there was basically nobody, there were no international observers from what I could see in the room. Like, it was just me and my translator who were attending the trials. And for me, that just seemed quite shocking, because I was thinking like all the rhetoric from the EU, when you listen to them talk, they say saving lives and tackling smugglers, or saving lives and stopping smugglers. But the fact that these smugglers were arrested, the victims who were testifying say that they feel like their lives could be in danger. Like, they want to testify anyway, but they don't know what's going to happen to them afterwards. And they're surprised that there's not international support as well, that like there's been no international interest. And I mean, at the moment, most of them still have faith in the Ethiopian system, but like there are, you know, the 2 men are trying to bribe everybody, basically, according to the prosecutors, the Ethiopian prosecutors. So they're trying to get out of prison. They were even trying to bribe the witnesses literally right before the court hearing, like offering them more money than they had paid in total for ransoms. And again, I just thought that that highlights that, you know, I think it's important that people look at the rhetoric that they're being told, the reasons that they're being told that certain policies exist, and then also question, you know, is it victim-centric? You know, are we actually supporting the actual victims in this, the people who are most vulnerable? And the problem with the interceptions at sea is that when refugees try to cross, they are sent back and they get caught in this cycle. So they're trapped between detention centers, then back with smugglers, then try to go to sea, then back to detention centers, then to smugglers. And it means that there's now no way out. Like, without a massive increase in legal routes, there's just no way out of the system. And I thought there's other people that would definitely talk about search and rescue a lot better, but it's worth also saying that the EU is both flying aircraft to spot where the boats are, which they then can send to the Libyan Coast Guard. And they've now also signed a deal, or multiple deals, for €100 million to fly drones as well. So there'll be drones looking out for refugee boats to send them back. So that's pretty much, I think I actually finished 2 minutes early, but that's all I have to say.
I mean, I think that, the 3 of you, we could just go on and on and on and on. I mean, one thing that that makes me feel so proud to be here on this panel with you is that, I mean, it's because you are young, you are from kind of the younger generation segment I could mention. And I want to ask a question to the 3 of you in no particular order. What did motivate you to get into this initially? I mean, how did it happen? Maybe you were in university. I won't tell the story for you, Sally, but anybody who could tell us, I mean, how did you get into this?
Yeah, I think it was this in this specific context, this project, but I think to really start also working on it on a longer run. I mean, as we try to point out, that we kind of, on the one hand, it's hard to believe, especially I think maybe even for law students, it's maybe even more difficult to see this huge discrepancy between what is the law and what is the reality. And it's like in contrast to Libya, we have this happening on European soil. And I think that's kind of, there's like a crack, but maybe this caused a bit of a crack in this belief in this universality, or this idea of universal human rights that we always in Europe, I mean, it's part of how we always portray ourselves and the values that we always talk about, European values, human rights, unconditional for everybody, but then you see that it's just not true and it's just a lie, and that we live with this every day. And at the same time, knowing that as a European citizen, this happens, as Sally mentioned several times, it happens in our names. So we're part of the society that keeps these situations alive. So I think that's the main point.
Thank you. Francisca, maybe you would like to add something?
Yeah, maybe also I agree with what Philipp said, and also additionally maybe like that I see it as a responsibility as a person that had the luck and the privilege to grow up in Europe, to be born in Europe, to grow up in Europe, to my whole life only benefit from the European structure. And when on the same side, and on the same level, like this, Europe creates such structure of deterrence at the outer border, I see it as my responsibility also to not just look at it and feel sorry about the people, but to kind of act on it.
For me, I mean, it's kind of strange when you're working as a journalist, because I don't think that most people, like, you don't decide exactly what you'll focus on. A lot of it is about you do one story and then people start contacting you and then more people contact you. And I started working on Libyan migrant detention centers because I had actually done reporting in Sudan, and I had met a lot of refugees who were traveling from Sudan, and that they were from Eritrea, so Eritreans who came to Sudan looking for safety and basically had been stuck in a situation where they were being exploited. Like, the police would arrest them constantly, women were being sexually harassed a lot, and I actually ended up reporting, again for Journalists for Transparency, about allegations of corruption in the UN Refugee Agency. So one of the big problems there was that refugees didn't trust in Unhcr. They said that staff were asking for bribes, that they were demanding tens of thousands of dollars to be resettled to safe countries. And we did an investigation. I mean, I did it with funding from you guys, and a UN investigation was launched, and it actually ended up with one staff member being found guilty of abusing power and soliciting bribes from refugees. I mean, refugees dare say that more people are guilty, but that was the finding of the internal investigation. But I think that showed that, you know, we have these arguments of like, well, why don't they just go to a safe country? But actually, if you're a refugee with no, you know, you have no documents necessarily, or you have no feeling of security, and the agency that you are, you know, counting on that's mandated to protect you, you don't have faith in it, of course you're then going to keep moving on because you're trying to find a country where you can feel secure. And that was, I reported on that, and a lot of the refugees in Sudan knew my reporting as a result of it. And when this war broke out in Zara, or in Tripoli, but in the Zara detention center, one of the guys asked his brother, who was in Sudan, who he could contact, because they hadn't spoken to a journalist before. And the brother said, apparently, you should contact Sally Hayden. So that was, I just got a message from a guy saying, I'm a refugee in a Libyan prison, like, can you tell people our story? So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a choice, but of course, you know, I'm always surprised. Like, people ask me that, and I'm like, why aren't more people listening? You know, like, why aren't more people doing this type of work? Because it's very easy for Europeans to just look away. Like, it's easy for them to be comfortable and just not pay attention. But I think that we should all be paying attention.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. Going back to you, I mean, when you were describing how things are, sorry for that, in the island, it was very hard for me to picture exactly how those, for the lack of a better word, how those kind of a, if there even exists, some kind of a governance structure. I mean, who is actually on top of it? If it's the government of Greece, who's below? How does that make sense? Where does the UN come in? Where does other big NGOs come in? Or is it just a chaos where everybody's trying to do something? How is it? How could you explain it to the audience? How does that look in the ground?
I would say it's a very well orchestrated chaos, or like it's, yeah, I mean, the authorities are there, and I mean the reception facility is managed by a Greek authority, the reception and identification center, and then there's the Greek asylum service. And so the basic infrastructure in order to implement this EU-Turkey deal is there. The problem is that it just doesn't work, or it never really worked the way that it was intended. But I mean, and that's, so there was also never, after 2016 that this was put in place, there was never a reaction to that. Like, the camp facilities were never increased. There was never really an attempt to address this constant, overburdened and overwhelmed authorities. And of course, I think it's, then there are many NGOs, or increasingly more NGOs. I mean, UNHCR is taking part of the work from the government by providing housing, but I mean, also it depends. A lot of it depends on the work of NGOs, like as Franzi mentioned, MSF is providing, and another NGO, Mediquality Team, they are providing essential health services, and that's providing people with medication, and that the others would, like, they would just not get it. And the authorities, they have started to rely on this supply by NGOs. The same when the fire happened, like, nobody was given a tent or mattress or sheet. Also when they arrived, they're not given anything, but if they're lucky, there are some NGOs that provide some of it, or otherwise they have to buy it if they have some resources, or people sleep outside for several days. That also happens quite often. So I think it's, yeah, it's a strange interplay of NGOs and the state authorities, but I think it's also pretty obvious that it's also within Greece, there's this dynamics between the central government in Athens leaving the local authorities also really alone with this problem, but at the same time, it's Europe leaving Greece entirely alone with this problem. So it's kind of a lack of responsibility also, I would say.
Yeah, and this also makes it quite difficult to address an actor responsible, because it's a lot of finger pointing. The Greek government says, okay, this is brought to us by European policy. The Europeans say, okay, we would like to give them more money to build new camp structures or whatever, but they don't, Greece doesn't accept it because they run it. Then there's UNHCR, which the role is quite unsure, and everyone is saying, okay, why does UNHCR does not do more? They say we cannot do more because our mandate is limited, and it's just a lot of finger pointing secured by regulations like the Dublin regulations, and now also maybe the new pact of migration and so on. So it's very hard to grasp.
Maybe just to add to that, at the same time, that's why for like in our view, it's really a political decision that the situation is as it is, and it's not just a lack or like this, like it's, in my view, it's really a decision that is taken in Europe, because like the Central European countries as Germany are kind of profiting from this situation, from this, that, I mean, when the German Minister of the Interior says that we are not going to evacuate anybody because we are waiting for a European solution, but everybody knows, or has, like, everybody knows that this European solution will not come, and the true, like, European member states will never agree on a mechanism to distribute migrants. And so, I mean, saying that we are waiting for a European solution is essentially saying that we will leave the situation as it is because for us it's fine.
Right, which is pretty pessimistic, to say the least. And I work in an NGO, and we're always sort of faced with this dilemma that it's not particularly to the work that we do. Perhaps it's more for the aid and humanitarian NGOs that once we step in. The government say, okay, these guys are taking care of it. I can just kind of, turn a blind eye, and they will kind of clean up the mess that I created or that was created in my backyard. I mean, how much do you that see? Because I mean, even with the greatest of intentions of the NGOs, their resources are limited. Their capacity to act or to take decisions may be constrained by the governments themselves. So, how do you see that happening in the island?
I'd say we are a good example of that, maybe, because of course our approach is also really limited. I mean, and we are also aware that we are filling a gap that shouldn't be there. There should be free legal information out there and assistance and representations for all of them. And of course, the situation should be a different one. And of course, you're always, I think all the NGOs are in this kind of difficult area of, on the one hand, trying to really react to the situation and trying to provide assistance, and at the same time you become part of a system, or you become kind of the system starts to rely on these actions or the service that you provide. And I think, it's like for us, it's also always a huge discussion, like in how far are we really fighting to abandon the whole system, or are we somehow just making it a little nicer?
Right, thanks a lot. And in your case, Ali, I mean, I know that you have been sort of deeply involved in dealing with the United Nations Human Rights Commission. But how do you see this same scenario happening in the places where you have been? I mean, do you have, once again, a wide array of factors, pointing fingers, being negligent, passing the ball to others, or do you see an absolute vacuum? What do you see there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there are a lot of NGOs working in Libya, but I mean, so one example I'll give is I was trying a lot to measure how many people were dying in detention centers. So I get a lot of reports of people dying from, medical neglect or from various other kind of illnesses or for other reasons, like even just the way that the whole thing is set up. Like one man died in what was thought to be an electrical fire. But I've gone around pretty much everybody asking who measures that. Like I asked the EU, they said it's not their responsibility. I asked the UN, they said it's not their responsibility. And yeah, the Libyan government, I mean, they also said, they didn't say it's not their responsibility, they just said they'd look into it when I asked a representative. But they're also not measuring it because they don't even have a registration system for who's in which detention center. And so, yeah, I think on some things there are NGOs that are providing certain services, but because there's basically no oversight, like there's no real oversight, and like I said, there's no one measuring the real consequences of what is happening.
Right, so even more daunting that I could have thought since the beginning. But yet, I mean, your work has focused a lot on the UN because of corruption with the people who are there that are supposed to assist the refugee seekers, and actually they are profiting from them. What did you discover when you were investigating that?
Well, yeah, I reported on corruption in the UN in Sudan, and like I said, there was an internal investigation, and they found one staff member definitely guilty of abusing power and soliciting bribes from refugees. In Libya, there have been allegations of corruption, but the bigger allegation is because the UN takes EU funding, that the UN is effectively whitewashing the impacts of the EU policy, and so there have been like a lot of situations where there'll be UN statements, like UN, I'm speaking mainly about Unhcr, the refugee agency, and then occasionally IOM, where there'll be allegations that they're essentially making the situation seem like it's a lot better than it is. For example, like when refugees are moved from one detention center to another, they've released statements saying things like they've been moved out of harm's way, which actually isn't, you know, it isn't really a reflection of what is actually happening. So I think in Libya, that would be a much bigger allegation.
Right. Well, kind of all things seem to point to the European Union, which of course is not a monolithic structure. It is composed of all the member countries and of course of different political beliefs, from the center, center-left, and worryingly, increasingly to center-right, to the extreme right. So these make actually, sadly, make sort of the future potentially far more worrying that we may imagine. But then again, you said it, not in our name. The EU and our governments, or your governments, to be clearer, shouldn't be doing it on your names. What is it that people watching us, students, journalists, and anybody else who is right now underneath could do? I mean, how do they reach you? What else could they go? What could they read? I mean, what recommendations you could do? Because it is indeed, if people do not use the power of information that is there and the power of mobilization that is available here, nothing will change. What would be your kind of key recommendations as your last comments in this session?
I would say don't be fooled, and yeah, there's this German saying, aus den Augen, aus dem Sinn, so out of the sight, out of the mind, and yeah, keep talking about it, keep looking at the policies and discuss it with your, I don't know, friends and family, and yeah, make it a subject still, although you might not see it in Germany, in Berlin anymore. And I think this is an easy step which can be done and which may have an impact already.
Well, and I think my point fits perfectly to that, and also what you said in your introduction. I think it's also really a question how we react to these people. Like, how do we see them? And I think you pointed out really well that if somebody comes with a visa, it's an expat, and if somebody comes because they need protection or they had to flee their country, it's a migrant or asylum seeker, and we don't see these people as human beings, as equal. And I think that's something that is really lacking also in the whole, and that's why I think it's super important that journalists are reporting on the situation, but also to meet people and to interact with them and to really try to always keep in mind that, just that it's not a mass of people, but these are all individual people that have their stories, and they have lived their lives just as we did until something happened in their life which made them leave. And I think that could change a lot and could change also this huge shift in European politics towards the right that we're facing.
Very wise words. I mean, they were living their lives until something shattered their lives. Sally?
I mean, for me, like, I guess I'm a journalist, I'm not an activist, you know, it's not, I always feel like it's not my role to kind of get so involved in advocacy, except that I feel like my duty is to report what's going on, like, and also to make sure that there isn't a situation where people can say that they didn't know about this. And I guess for anybody else watching, like, just inform yourself. Like, there's so much reporting out there, and I know my reporting gets dismissed sometimes. People will be like, oh, but we all knew about this, but actually, like, journalists are working so hard to get this information out, and refugees are working so hard to get this information out. And I think people have a duty to make sure that they're listening.
Oh, thanks a lot. We have 15 minutes more, I understand, from, kind of more 10-ish, more or less, and somebody's raising the hand.
Yes, is this working? I wanted to ask a question to Sally, because I think that I mean, we usually at the Disruption Lab, we are trying to understand different phases of a problem, and we also ask ourselves why certain things are happening. So we are now speaking about the detention centers and the terrible condition the people are in, and torture and dehumanizing situation. But I wanted to try to discuss with you more what are the interest here, why certain things are legitimated, what is the economical interest that make possible that detention centers are functioning in this way, and even the route of migration are working in this way. So we mentioned the accountability and the responsibility of Europe, but I think these systemic structure are much bigger. So I also wanted to understand from you who has to be held responsible, especially understanding what are these interests behind all these discussion that we are having.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is something that like me and also better journalists than me have been reporting on. Like I said, the detention centers, there's a lot of like migration basically is big business in Libya. You know, there's like a lot of ways to make money off migrants. By ransoming them, like we said, by selling them back to traffickers in the detention centers. I mean, a lot of refugees will say, for example, that when aid is delivered, that the guards in the detention centers in some situations will just take it straight away again. They don't know where it goes, but potentially it's being sold, or, you know, it's being sent off somewhere else. Yeah, like forced labor, like there's a lot of, again, in detention centers, migrants will be used as, or refugees will be used as forced labor, so sent out to work on farms, sent out to work in the houses of rich Libyans, forcibly recruited as fighters. And I've actually interviewed refugees who have said that they like going out to do this work because, like, for example, in Trikasica, when there was a tuberculosis outbreak, it meant they actually get fresh air. But of course, that's terrible, you know, like they shouldn't be in a situation where they're desperate to do forced labor. And then there's been a lot of reporting. I mean, obviously more needs to be done to look into this, but in terms of like who is being awarded contracts, like there are, you know, militia leaders have been awarded contracts for things like catering, which means that they're having an opportunity to get money out of this. There was a big scandal around the what was called the Gathering and Departure Facility, which was UNHCR supported or run center. It was meant to be an alternative to detention, where refugees were brought when they were taken out of, when they were going to be evacuated, essentially. But it was built, it was kind of controlled by militia fighters, like certainly on the outside. Like I interviewed refugees who were forced to labor in there. They said that that things like military training were going on in there, and that was funded partly by the EU and then eventually closed down, or at the moment I think it's still not operative, but I know that it stopped operating last January, I think. And so, yeah, like I think that more reporting needs to be done on this, because obviously there's like the different detention centers are being run by different militias, which makes it quite hard to have an oversight. But yeah, there's like a lot of ways to make money.
Thank you. So do we have time to open up questions from the audience? Which I really thank you for standing there and your patience. I don't know exactly how this works, so you can tell me.
So there were quite a lot of questions also from the audience in the chat. Some have already been answered in between, but there's one question which is a bit also about the relation between your work. So how important is reporting on the situation in the home countries and on these flight routes for the legal team? And how is information made available in order to be used for asylum procedures? So is there a working relation between journalists and lawyers on the topic?
That's a question for Philipp and Francisca, I believe.
And how far we inform people about, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Please. You
So if you have a working relationship with journalists as well in your work, and how this information is shared between you and used in asylum procedures?
I mean, the touches upon different parts. I mean, with regard to reporting about the situation in Europe and drawing attention to the situation, we try to work with journalists, and there are always journalists coming and going to the island. In regard to the asylum procedures, I would say not really. I mean, the information about the home country, I mean, it's the people, they have to tell their stories anyway, so there's not a much need to have journalists be part of that.
Yeah, and also the situation on Samos doesn't count for the asylum procedure. No, but also I think we take advantage of reports, especially in our work with the interim measures, because I mean, when we as the Refugee Law Clinic Berlin on Samos claim that the situation is like this and this is the one thing, but if there are reports and articles about the situation, then we can use this as proof, and it's more commonly known and then also seen. I guess I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and maybe also in the asylum procedure, of course, you can rely on reporting of journalists, and sometimes this can be helpful if the authorities are not really aware of the situation in a country or in a country they might have passed, and your story otherwise just, and this happens actually often, that it just sounds a bit too crazy, so you get this answer from authorities. But I mean, that in these kind of circumstances, of course, independent journalism and reporting is super helpful.
Okay, so we have 5 more minutes, so let's try to sort of honor all the questions that we have. Potentially afterwards, I don't know, Tatiana, if you do this, maybe you can write up the questions, and perhaps Sally, Francisca, and Philipp can, answer them and give them back to you, so you can respond to the viewers, because I'm sure that many of them really, really want to know.
Yeah, I mean, here we have also the speakers, they could also ask questions.
Yeah, there's another question, which is also a very, very broad one, actually, from the audience. So somebody made the comment that there's actually been a number of studies done, also in the US, about how refugees and immigrants more generally actually greatly boost the economy. But of course, unfortunately, some politicians currently are framing the issue very differently. So could you share any thoughts of what you think could be done to make a shift in another direction here?
I mean, I would agree with the statement, and actually we had this study from the Bertelsmann Foundation, also in Germany, that had a pretty similar result. And that's a bit like the last point that I tried to make. I think we also need to rethink the whole issue of migration, and as long as we only see them like people as a threat that could take away something, and we completely miss the part how enriching it can be for society, also not only economically, then I think that would change a lot, and I think it needs kind of a shift in the mindset in Europe.
Although one has to say that this only seeing migrations as an economic advantage is also not a preferred way of portrayal that should be preferred, but seeing them just as human beings would do already good, I think.
Yeah. So we have questions here as well. We got one in the back, 2, 3. We have 2 questions, so let's go quickly because we're running out of time. Let's keep the answers short and snappy. Please.
Perhaps this is a question to Sally more. I was wondering whether you would agree to say that the disaster that the Libyan sort of situation is kind of proves the point that this idea that you can externalize border protection is undoable, even in terms of, even with like the very cynical view of trying to model it in a way that doesn't care about the people, but simply wants to restrict legal obligations of European countries. and that it's only possible in Libya because of the situation, the very peculiar situation of that country. Would you agree with that?
I answer now. Yeah, I mean, normally when I talk about this, because I'm mainly in touch with refugees who are from other countries, I talk about them. But of course, like, I always myself as well need to remember to say that Libyans are suffering too. Like, Libyans are suffering so much. That country has been through so much. And I actually was on a refugee rescue boat last Christmas, and 32 Libyans were rescued by the boat, and they were fleeing militias. Like, they all said that they were fleeing militias. And yeah, there is a big question about what role the EU is playing in terms of like empowering militias in Libya that are then making Libya unlivable for Libyans. And like, yeah, I think that there may be a lot more Libyans trying to flee as well.
Right, we have one more question on the very back.
Yes, hi. It's probably more a comment. I think we need something like Fridays for Future for the migration refugee thing that is happening, because if there are these islands in front of Greece, there is Libya, there are millions and millions of people that flee, and they don't want to go to Europe because they are interested in Europe culture, or they want to see the Alps or anything, but they flee their own country because they are in danger of death and like severe things. So if we don't change this situation, it's never going to get any better. We cannot have all the people of South America and Africa that are feeling bad move to Europe. It will not change. So there has to be a whole change of the whole thing. But we are also responsible because the German wealth or the European wealth is happening because of this, or it's involved together. You know, we eat meat that is because of the soy, and because of the soy, the Amazon is burned down, and because it's burned down, the people have to go. So it's a whole circle. And if we don't end this whole circle, it will never end, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe we have time for one last question coming from the audience. Hope we could have all night here, but we can't.
Maybe a nice question also to end with, if you could say something about what you think that we can do to make the EU more accountable in this situation.
Legally or morally?
Any way possible.
What we can do to make them more accountable. I mean, we try. Yes, well, if we had the answer to the question, we would be doing it.
Maybe it's a difficult question, but maybe also ourselves feel accountable, and because we are Europe, and if we don't feel accountable, then and demand it from our politicians, then it doesn't do any difference.
I mean, like I said, I'm not an activist. I'm just trying to report. But I do think again that the whole system is deliberately opaque, and I do think again it stops with Europeans themselves. Then there are member states. Like when I talk to EU politicians, they say, well, we have no power. You know, it's the member states that make the decisions. And I just think on every level there needs to be accountability. But I mean, I'm obviously a big believer in journalism. I think there needs to be awareness to be accountability, and so we just need to keep documenting what's happening, and people need to keep informing themselves and then calling for answers.
I mean, from my side, of course, I mean, there is an European Parliament, and the Europeans vote for the parliamentarians. So get involved, check out who's actually supposed to be representing you. And from there on, you can actually start exerting certain amount of power. You know, democracies and voting systems are not perfect, but they are the least imperfect thing that we have around to make politicians accountable. So I guess that we have come to an end. I thank once again Tatiana and all the crew at Disruption Lab. It was a privilege for me to be here. It's an excellent occasion, and I'm really happy to have met you, Francisca and Philipp. Hopefully we can stay in touch. And Sally, it's a pleasure to be in contact with you once again and see you once again. And to the audience here and the audience in the virtual setting, and trying to move to the next session. Thank you very much. I'm Roberto Perez-Rocha. It has been an honor for me being here.
So I really wanted to thank you for this session, and thanks to all the speakers that were here and for the moderation. And I would like to say to the audience that is following us online that now we do 45 minutes break, and we will come back with the next panel that is about illegal pushbacks and border violence. At the same time, for the COVID regulation, we will ask the speakers to leave the room, and we are back in 45 minutes when we will all breathe fresh air from in this room. Thank you.